There are some places in Louisiana where the air itself feels wrong, where the Spanish moss hangs so thick from the cypress trees that it blocks out the sun, and the bayou water sits black and still as a mirror reflecting nothing but darkness back at you. Bellefontaine Plantation was one of those places, and I should have known better than to answer their summons. My name is Dr. Catherine Mercier, and in 1860, I was one of the few women practicing medicine in the Louisiana Territory. I'd built my reputation delivering babies throughout the parishes, from the poorest sharecropper's shack to the grandest plantation houses. I'd seen difficult births, stillbirths, and complications that would make even the most hardened physician blanch. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for what I would witness at Bellefontaine. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, delivered by a man who wouldn't meet my eyes. The paper was expensive, cream-colored vellum with an embossed seal, but the ink had been applied with a trembling hand. Dr. Mercier, it read, "Your presence is urgently required at Bellefontaine Plantation. Madame Dupont is with child and requires your specific expertise. You will be compensated handsomely. A carriage will collect you at dawn. Come alone. Tell no one where you are going. Monsieur Philippe Dupont." The last two instructions should have sent me running. Any physician worth their salt knows that secrecy in medical matters rarely bodes well. But the sum mentioned was enough to keep my practice running for a year, and I'd heard whispers about the Duponts. Old money, older secrets. A family that had occupied that land since before Louisiana was even American territory. The carriage that arrived was black lacquered wood with no family crest, no identifying marks whatsoever. The driver was a thin, elderly man who spoke not a single word during the entire 3-hour journey deeper into the bayou country. I watched the landscape change outside my window as we traveled. The neat farms and townships gave way to wild, untamed swampland. The road became little more than a raised path of packed earth cutting through standing water and gnarled trees. When Bellefontaine finally emerged from the morning mist, I felt my breath catch. The house was massive, a decaying monument to antebellum excess. White columns, once grand, were now stained green with mold and draped in curtains of moss. The windows were dark, like empty eye sockets in a skull. The grounds, which must have once been magnificent, had been allowed to run wild. Overgrown gardens pressed against the house itself, as if nature were trying to reclaim what had been stolen from it. As the carriage rolled to a stop, I noticed something else. Silence. Complete and utter silence. No birds sang in those twisted trees. No insects buzzed in the thick, humid air. Even the wind seemed to have abandoned this place. It was as if Bellefontaine existed in a pocket removed from the natural world, a bubble where normal rules didn't apply. The front door opened before I could knock, and I found myself face to face with Philippe Dupont. He was a tall man, well-dressed in clothes that had been expensive once but were now slightly shabby, as if he were maintaining appearances that no longer needed maintaining. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and ringed with the kind of shadows that speak of many sleepless nights. But it was his hands I noticed most. They trembled constantly, a fine shake that he couldn't quite control. "Dr. Mercier," he said, and his voice was hoarse, as if he hadn't used it in some time. "Thank God you've come. Please come inside. My wife, she..." Time is growing short. I followed him into the house, and the temperature dropped at least 10 degrees the moment I crossed the threshold. The interior was as decayed as the exterior, though attempts had been made to keep up appearances. Dust sheets covered most of the furniture in the grand entrance hall. The chandelier overhead was tarnished and missing half its crystals. Our footsteps echoed on marble floors that hadn't been properly cleaned in years. As we climbed the grand staircase, I began to notice the portraits. They lined the walls, generation after generation of Duponts staring down with cold, judgmental eyes. But there was something strange about them. In every single portrait, the children were positioned oddly, their clothing arranged to carefully conceal their arms, their necks, any exposed skin covered by elaborate collars and long sleeves. Even in portraits where such clothing seemed inappropriate for the setting or season. "Your family has lived here long?" I asked, trying to fill the oppressive silence. "Since 1782, Philippe answered without looking back. We are one of the oldest families in Louisiana. This land, this house, it is everything to us. We would do anything to preserve it. Something in the way he emphasized anything made my skin crawl. We reached the second floor, and Philippe led me down a long hallway lit only by a few sputtering candles. The doors we passed were all closed, but I could swear I heard sounds behind them. Soft crying, the shuffle of small feet, a child's whisper, too low to make out the words but carrying a tone of desperate sadness. "How many children do you have, Monsieur Dupont?" I asked. He stopped walking so abruptly I nearly collided with him. When he turned to face me, his expression was one of such profound grief and terror that I took an involuntary step backward. "4," he whispered. "We have 4 children. And if God is merciful, this 5th birth will be different. It has to be different." Before I could ask what he meant, he threw open the door at the end of the hall. The bedroom was large but dark, heavy velvet curtains drawn against the afternoon sun. The air was thick with incense and something else, something sweetly rotten that I couldn't quite identify. In the center of the room, in a massive 4-poster bed, lay Madame Evangeline Dupont. She couldn't have been more than 25, but she looked ancient. Her skin had the pale, waxy quality of a corpse, stretched tight over sharp bones. Her belly was swollen with late pregnancy, a grotesque contrast to her emaciated frame. But it was her eyes that truly disturbed me. They were wide, unblinking, and held an expression of such absolute terror that I felt it like a physical force. "Madame Dupont," I said gently, approaching the bed. "I'm Dr. Mercier. I'm here to help you." Her eyes fixed on me, and her cracked lips moved. At first, no sound came out, then a whisper so faint I had to lean in close to hear it. "Don't let it be born," she breathed. "Please, doctor, don't let it be born with the marks. I can't bear it again." "Evangeline," Philippe said sharply from the doorway, "control yourself." I whirled on him. "Monsieur Dupont, I must ask you to leave. The presence of the father during delivery only causes distress to the mother." He opened his mouth to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced him. With one last, haunted look at his wife, he withdrew, closing the door behind him. I turned back to Evangeline and took her hand. It was cold as ice despite the stifling heat of the room. "Madam, I need you to breathe. Can you do that for me? Nice, slow breaths." She tried, but each breath came in a ragged gasp. As I examined her, I realized she was much further along in labor than I'd expected. The child would be coming soon, within the hour if I wasn't mistaken. "How long have you been in labor?" I asked. "Since yesterday morning," she whispered. "But I didn't call for you. Philippe did. I told him not to. I told him to let us both die." I'd heard women say such things in the throes of difficult labor before, pain and exhaustion speaking rather than their true hearts. But there was a cold certainty in Evangeline's voice that chilled me. "Madam, everything is going to be fine. I've delivered hundreds of babies. You and your child will both come through this healthy and whole." She laughed then, a horrible, broken sound that dissolved into sobs. "You don't understand. You don't know. They're never whole. Never. They come into this world already broken, already scarred by what came before, already dying." "What do you mean, scarred?" But before she could answer, a contraction seized her, and she screamed. It was a sound of pure agony, but more than that. It was a sound of grief, of horror, of a soul being torn apart. The labor progressed rapidly after that. Too rapidly. I barely had time to prepare my instruments and linens before I could see the crown of the infant's head. Evangeline screamed throughout, not the normal screams of childbirth, but the screams of someone watching their worst nightmares manifest in reality. "Push, madam, push," I commanded, and she did with the last reserves of her strength. The child emerged in a rush of blood and fluid, and I caught it in my practiced hands. A girl, small but appearing healthy, her lungs working as she drew her first breath and released an indignant wail. I should have felt relief, satisfaction at another successful delivery. Instead, I felt my blood turn to ice. I stood there, frozen, the squalling infant in my hands, unable to process what I was seeing. Because there, on the child's tiny body, were scars. Not birthmarks, not the minor skin imperfections that sometimes appear on newborns. These were scars, old scars, the kind left by deep wounds, fully healed. A long, thin line ran across the baby's throat, puckered and white. Her tiny arms bore marks that looked like ligature scars, encircling her wrists. And across her chest, a wide, ragged scar that looked for all the world like a blade wound. "No!" Evangeline wailed from the bed. "No, no, no. Not again. Dear God, not again." My medical training took over, moving my hands through the necessary motions even as my mind reeled. I cleaned the infant, cut the cord, swaddled her. But I couldn't stop staring at those impossible scars. Scars that could not exist on a newborn child. "How?" I whispered. "How is this possible?" Evangeline had turned her face to the wall and was sobbing quietly. Outside the door, I heard footsteps. Philippe entered without knocking, his face haggard with hope and dread in equal measure. Does the child?" He couldn't finish the question. Wordlessly, I held out the swaddled infant. He took her with shaking hands, pulled back the blanket to look at her face, and I watched hope die in his eyes. He saw the scar on her throat, and the sound that came from him was barely human. "Another one," he choked out. "Another one marked. Another one remembering." "Remembering?" I demanded. "Monsieur Dupont, you must tell me what is happening here. This child, these scars, they're impossible. What have you done?" He looked at me with eyes that held a terrible, ancient grief. "Not what we've done, doctor. What was done to us. What was done long ago, and what we can never, never escape. I should have left right then. Should have gathered my things, demanded my fee, and fled back to New Orleans without looking back. But I'm a physician, and that newborn child was my patient, impossible scars or not. And more than that, I needed to understand. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in science and medicine, was screaming that what I'd seen couldn't be real. So when Philippe invited me to stay the night before my return journey, claiming the roads were unsafe after dark, I agreed. God help me, I agreed. A servant, an elderly woman who moved through the house like a ghost, showed me to a guest room on the 3rd floor. The room was dusty but serviceable, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the wild, overgrown grounds. As the sun set, casting long shadows through the twisted trees, I stood at that window and tried to make sense of what I'd witnessed. I'd seen birth defects before, certainly. Cleft palates, clubbed feet, port wine stains. But scars? Healed scar tissue on a child who had never been cut, never been burned, never been injured? It defied every law of medicine and nature. Unless, the thought came unbidden, and I tried to push it away, but it persisted. Unless the child had been injured, in another life, in a life lived before this one. I shook my head, angry at myself for entertaining such superstitious nonsense. I was a woman of science, educated in the finest medical traditions. Reincarnation was a fairy tale, a comfort for those afraid of death's finality. There had to be another explanation. As darkness fell completely, I heard it. Children's voices, singing. The sound was faint, coming from somewhere below me, but clear enough that I could make out the melody. It was a lullaby, but sung in a minor key, transformed into something mournful and strange. I left my room and descended to the 2nd floor, following that eerie singing. The hallway was dark except for a single lamp burning at the far end, and the portraits on the walls seemed to watch me with knowing eyes. The singing grew louder as I approached a door, light spilling from the gap beneath it. I knocked softly. The singing stopped instantly. "Come in," said a child's voice, young but utterly without inflection. I opened the door and froze. The room was large, clearly a nursery or playroom. For children sat in a circle on the floor, ranging in age from perhaps 4 to 10 years old. They were all staring at me with the same hollow, knowing eyes I'd seen in their father's face. The oldest, a boy, spoke first. You're the doctor. The one who delivered Marie. Marie. Our new sister. That's what they'll call her. They always use the same names. There's always a Marie. He gestured to himself. I'm Thomas. The fourth Thomas. He pointed to the others in turn. That's Celeste the third. That's Henri the second. And that's Josephine also the second. The first Josephine lived longer. The casual way he spoke, the matter-of-fact tone about impossible things, was more disturbing than any horror. The fourth Thomas? I repeated carefully, stepping into the room. I don't understand. Yes, you do, said the girl called Celeste. She was perhaps 7, with dark curls and solemn eyes. You saw Marie's scars. We all have them. She pulled down the collar of her nightgown to reveal a thick scar running across her collarbone. This is where the wagon wheel crushed me. The last time, when I was the second Celeste. Young Henri, no more than 5, held up his hands. His small palms were crosshatched with white scar tissue. I touched the stove. I was only 3 years old that time. I didn't know better. It hurt so much. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if discussing something that had happened to someone else. Stop it, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. This is absurd. Your children. Someone has been filling your heads with terrible stories. Thomas laughed, but there was no humor in it. Stories? Is that what you think? He stood up and I saw he walked with a limp. Do you want to see my scars, doctor? The ones that killed the last Thomas. Before I could stop him, he pulled up his shirt. His thin chest was covered in scars, dozens of them, in various states of old healing. But the worst was a ragged, terrible mark over his heart, the kind of wound that would have been instantly fatal. Trampled by horses, he said conversationally. The third Thomas loved horses, but they spooked during a storm. I remember every second of it. The hooves coming down, the pain, the darkness, and then waking up as a baby, knowing exactly what had happened, knowing I'd been here before, knowing I'd be here again. I felt my knees weaken and grabbed the doorframe for support. This is impossible. Come with us, Josephine said suddenly. She was the youngest, barely able to walk steadily, but she moved toward me with purpose. We'll show you. Then you'll understand. The 4 children filed out of the room, and against my better judgment, I followed them. They led me down the hallway, past the other closed doors, to a narrow staircase I hadn't noticed before. The stairs led down into darkness, and Celeste lit a candle to guide us. We descended into what must have been the oldest part of the house, stone walls slick with moisture, the air cold and smelling of earth and decay. The children moved with the confidence of frequent visitors, but I had to feel my way carefully along the narrow passage. Finally, we emerged into a large cellar room. The candlelight flickered across stone walls covered in something that made my breath catch. Names. Hundreds of names, carved into the stone. And next to each name, a date of birth and a date of death. Thomas Dupont, 1782 to 1785. Cause, fever. Celeste Dupont, 1784 to 1787. Cause, drowning. Marie Dupont, 1785 to 1786. Cause, stillborn. Henri Dupont, 1787 to 1789. Cause, fall. And on, going back generations. But then I noticed the pattern. The names repeated. Thomas Dupont appeared 7 times on that wall. Celeste, 6 times. The same names over and over, each with their own birth date, death date, and cause of death. We remember all of them, Celeste whispered. Every life, every death. We're born knowing what came before. Born with the scars of how we died. Born into this same house, this same family, this same curse. Curse, I managed to say. Young Thomas stepped forward, his face ancient despite his 10 years. In 1782, this plantation was failing. The first Philippe Dupont, our great-great-great-grandfather, was desperate. He had lost everything in a bad business venture, was about to lose the land. So he made a deal with something that came from the bayou one night. Something old and dark that offered him wealth and prosperity in exchange for one thing. He paused, and the silence stretched out. In exchange for us, he finished, his descendants, his children, we would be bound to this land forever. We would die and we would be reborn again and again, always as Duponts, always in this house, always carrying the memories of every death, every life, every moment of suffering. Our souls trapped, recycled, unable to move on. We are the price the family paid for their prosperity. I wanted to call them liars. I wanted to tell them it was all an elaborate trick, a cruel game played by disturbed children. But I'd seen Marie's scars with my own eyes. I'd caught that baby as she emerged from her mother's womb, and those scars had already been there. Show me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Show me proof. Something more than stories and names on a wall. Thomas nodded as if he'd been expecting this. Follow me. He led us back upstairs, but this time to the ground floor, to a door I'd assumed led to a closet. Instead, it opened onto a narrow study, the walls lined with books and ledgers. Thomas pulled down a heavy leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed with age, and laid it on the desk. The family keeps records, he said, flipping through pages covered in cramped handwriting. Every birth, every death, every time one of us comes back. Look, I leaned over the book, scanning the entries. They were written in different hands, different generations of Duponts recording the impossible. May 3rd, 1803, Celeste reborn. Second life. Scars present from drowning death in first life. Marks on neck and lungs weak. Father Philippe notes she cried for 3 days without stopping, as if remembering the water. September 12, 1809, Thomas reborn. Third life. Scars from previous trampling visible on chest and legs. Child spoke his own name at age 2 months, along with the phrase, the horses, the horses. January 7, 1821, Marie reborn. Fourth life. Stillborn in third life, bore marks of the cord around neck. Lived 7 years before cholera took her. Her final words were, I don't want to come back. Page after page, entry after entry, documenting 2 centuries of this nightmarish cycle. Children born with the scars of their deaths. Children who spoke too early, knew too much, remembered things they shouldn't be able to remember. But it was the final section of the current ledger that made my blood run cold. It was written in Philippe's shaking hand, dated just 3 months ago. February 14, 1860, Evangeline is with child again. We pray this time will be different. We pray the curse can be broken. But I fear I know the truth. There is no escape for our children. They are born, they suffer, they die, and they are born again. The cycle continues. Last night, I dreamed of the thing in the bayou, the thing my ancestor made his bargain with. It was laughing. I closed the book, my hands trembling. You're telling me your ancestor made a deal with what? A demon? Some sort of swamp monster? We don't know what it was, Celeste said quietly. The first Philippe never wrote down exactly what came to him that night. But whatever it was, it gave him everything he wanted. The plantation prospered. The family grew wealthy. Duponts became one of the most powerful names in Louisiana. And all it cost was us, the children, trapped forever, dying and being reborn, carrying our traumas with us, never allowed to rest. Henri, the youngest boy, tugged on my skirt. When I looked down at him, tears were streaming down his small face. It hurts, doctor. Every time it hurts. We remember dying and then we're born and we're babies, but we know. We know what happened to us. We know it will happen again. And we can't tell anyone because we can't talk yet. And by the time we can, everyone thinks we're just strange children making up stories. But you're not making up stories, I said. And it wasn't a question anymore. I couldn't deny what was in front of me. Josephine, who had been silent until now, spoke up in her small voice. The new Marie. She died in her last life when she was only 3 years old. Someone hurt her. Someone killed her. That's why she has the scar across her throat. She was murdered. The room seemed to tilt around me. Murdered? Who? Why? We don't always know, Thomas said. Sometimes we die from sickness or accidents. But sometimes someone in the family gets tired of us. tired of our questions, our memories, the way we look at them, and they can see we're not really children. So they decide to speed up the cycle. If we die young enough, maybe we'll be reborn quickly. Maybe we won't remember as much. That's madness. That's our life, Celeste said simply. Death doesn't free us, Doctor. It just starts the count until we have to come back and do it all over again. A sound from above made us all freeze. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crossing the floor overhead. Then Philippe's voice calling out, "Dr. Mercier? Where are you? We must speak." The children shrank back, and I saw real fear in their ancient eyes. Thomas grabbed my arm. "Don't tell him we showed you, please. He gets angry when we share the truth with outsiders. He thinks if he keeps the secret well enough, maybe it will go away." I nodded and watched the children scatter, disappearing into the shadows of the old house like ghosts. Which, in a way, I suppose they were. I found Philippe in the main parlor, a glass of whiskey in his shaking hand, staring into a cold fireplace. He looked up when I entered, and I was struck by how much he'd aged just in the few hours since I'd arrived. The man was being eaten alive from the inside. "Doctor," he said, attempting a smile that came out as more of a grimace. "I hope the children weren't bothering you. They can be peculiar." "Peculiar," I repeated, taking a seat across from him. My mind was racing, trying to process everything I'd learned. "Monsieur Dupont, I need you to tell me the truth. All of it. What is happening in this house?" He took a long drink, draining the glass, and poured another. "The truth? The truth is that my family is damned. Has been damned for over 70 years. And there's nothing any of us can do about it. Your children told me about the curse. About the original bargain." His face went white. "They told you? All of it?" When I nodded, he let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. "Of course they did. They're too smart, you see. Born with all their memories intact. My oldest, Thomas, he could recite the family history at age 3. Could tell me how he died as the third Thomas, trampled by horses when he was 12 years old. Do you know what it's like, Doctor, watching your son play and knowing he's already lived and died twice before? Knowing he carries the memory of his own violent death. I can't imagine," I said honestly. "Evangeline and we thought perhaps this time would be different. We prayed, we consulted priests, we even tried to leave this place. But the curse follows the bloodline. We made it as far as Baton Rouge before Evangeline collapsed. The doctors there said it was as if the child in her womb was fighting to come back here. She nearly died. So we returned, and we resigned ourselves to bringing another trapped soul into this world." He stood abruptly and began pacing. "You want to know the worst part? It's not just that they remember. It's that each life, each death, makes them more damaged. Thomas was a relatively normal boy in his first life, aside from the fever that took him. But by his second life, he already carried the weight of that death. By his third, after the trampling, he was starting to break. Now, in his fourth life, I look in his eyes and I see someone who has suffered too much, lived too long in too small a space. He's 10 years old and he's ancient. Can't you break the curse? Find whoever your ancestor made the deal with and negotiate a new arrangement." Philippe laughed bitterly. "We've tried. Every generation, someone tries. My father tried. He went into the bayou to find the thing that made the original bargain. He was gone for 3 days. When he came back, he never spoke again. Just sat in his chair, staring at nothing, until he died. And do you know what was the first thing Thomas said when he was reborn after my father's attempt? He said, 'Grandfather found it. Still waiting. It will never let us go.' A chill ran down my spine. What does it want? Why does it keep your children trapped? I don't know. Suffering, perhaps? Entertainment? Maybe it feeds on the cycle of death and rebirth, on the anguish of souls unable to rest. Or maybe there's no reason at all beyond the simple fact that a bargain was made and a price must be paid. Forever." He turned to face me fully, and I saw tears tracking down his haggard face. "I loved my children, Doctor. I love them still. But they're not really children, are they? They're prisoners wearing children's faces. And every day I see them suffering. I see them carrying the weight of multiple lifetimes of pain. Sometimes I wonder if it would be kinder to. He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I understood what he was implying, and horror flooded through me. You can't mean to kill them. No, no, he said quickly, but his eyes told a different story. Of course not. But they die anyway, doctor. They always die. Sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. And then they come back and it starts all over again. Wouldn't it be mercy to try to end the cycle? If there were no Dupont children to be reborn into, perhaps their souls could finally be free. Or perhaps you'd damn them to some worse fate, I countered. You don't know what happens to them between death and rebirth. Maybe that's the only peace they get, however brief. He collapsed back into his chair, defeated. You're right. I'm not brave enough to risk it anyway. I'm not brave enough for much of anything. I just wanted this newest child to be different. I wanted Marie to be born clean, unburdened. But she has the scar across her throat, and I know that means in her last life, someone killed her. Killed a 3-year-old child. And she'll remember it. She'll grow up remembering her own murder. We sat in silence for a long moment. Outside, night had fully fallen, and the darkness pressed against the windows like something alive. I could hear the house settling around us, creaks and groans that sounded almost like whispers. I need to see your wife, I said finally, to check on her recovery and the baby. Philippe nodded wearily. Of course. But doctor, don't tell Evangeline what the children said to you. She's fragile enough as it is. Every birth breaks her a little more. I'm afraid that if she knows you know the truth, if she has to face it reflected in your eyes, she might not survive. I made my way back upstairs, my medical bag in hand, but my mind was reeling. Everything I'd been taught, everything I believed about the natural world, had been turned inside out. I was a woman of science trapped in a Gothic nightmare, and I had no idea how to escape. When I reached Evangeline's room, I found her sitting up in bed, the newborn Marie cradled in her arms. The baby was nursing, her tiny fist clenched against her mother's breast. For a moment, it was such a normal, peaceful scene that I almost convinced myself everything else had been a fever dream. Then Evangeline looked up at me, and I saw that her eyes were completely empty. She has the scars, Evangeline said in a monotone. She'll remember. In a few months, maybe a year, she'll be old enough to tell us how she died. How someone cut her throat when she was just a baby. And we'll have to live with that knowledge. Live with her living with that knowledge until something kills her again and the cycle continues. Madame Dupont, do you know what the worst part is, doctor? She continued as if I hadn't spoken. I remember them. Every version of every child. I was here when the third Thomas died under those horses. I held the second Celeste as she drowned in the pond. I buried the fourth Marie after the cholera took her. And each time I knew they'd be back. I knew I'd have to watch them suffer again. This isn't motherhood. It's torture. She looked down at the nursing infant, and something in her expression made my blood run cold. It was the look of someone staring at a problem they'd finally decided to solve. Evangeline, I said carefully, moving closer. Let me take the baby. You need rest. Rest? She repeated and laughed. Yes, I need rest. We all need rest. An eternal rest. She stood suddenly, the baby still in her arms, and moved toward the window. I realized with horror that it was open, the curtains billowing in the night breeze. Below was a 3-story drop onto the stone terrace. The curse needs Dupont children to continue, Evangeline said conversationally. So if there are no children, I lunged forward, but she was closer to the window. Evangeline, stop. Think about what you're doing. I am thinking. For the first time in years, I'm thinking clearly. This child will live a life of suffering, die horribly, and be reborn to suffer again. I'm going to save her from that. I'm going to save all of us. By murdering your infant daughter? By setting her free. She was at the window now, holding the baby out over the drop. And then the others. And then myself. And then Philippe can follow or not, I don't care. But it ends tonight. The cycle ends tonight. I did the only thing I could think of. I screamed. My voice echoed through the old house, bouncing off walls and down hallways. Within seconds, I heard footsteps thundering up the stairs. Philippe burst through the door, took in the scene in a heartbeat, and froze. "Evangeline," he said carefully, "give the child to Dr. Mercier." "No," she said simply. "It has to end, Philippe. You know it has to end. We can't keep doing this. I can't keep watching them suffer." "You're not well," he said, edging into the room. "The birth, it's taken a toll. Just give me the baby and we'll talk about this." "We've been talking about this for years," she shrieked, and the baby in her arms began to wail. "Talking doesn't help. Nothing helps. They're dying and being reborn and suffering, and there's no escape. I'm giving them the only escape there is." Behind Philippe, I saw them, the 4 other children, crowding in the doorway, watching with those ancient, knowing eyes. Thomas met my gaze, and slowly, deliberately, he shook his head. It happened so fast. Evangeline's foot slipped on the polished floor. She stumbled backward, toward the open window, and for a moment she seemed suspended there, the baby still clutched to her chest. Philippe lunged forward, caught her arm, and there was a terrible few seconds where it could have gone either way. Then he yanked her back into the room, hard enough that she stumbled and fell. The baby went flying from her arms. I caught Marie instinctively, cradling her against my chest as her screams filled the room. Evangeline collapsed to the floor, sobbing hysterically, while Philippe stood over her, breathing hard. "Take the children," he said to me, his voice shaking. "Take them all. Get them away from here, just for tonight. Please." I gathered Marie close and ushered the other 4 children out of the room, down the hallway, away from their mother's broken wails. We ended up back in the nursery. The door closed against the sounds of anguish echoing through the house. "She's tried before," Celeste said matter-of-factly. "To kill us, to kill herself. She thinks it will free us." "Will it?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Thomas shrugged. "We don't know. We've never been murdered as infants, never had the whole line ended at once. Maybe it would free us. Maybe it would trap us in some worse way. Or maybe we'd just be reborn to different Duponts, cousins, or distant relatives, and the cycle would continue anyway. There has to be a way to break this," I said desperately. "Curses can be broken. Bargains can be renegotiated." "We've thought of everything, Doctor," young Henri said. "For generations, Duponts have tried. But the thing in the bayou, it doesn't want to renegotiate. It got what it wanted, and it's not letting go." I looked down at baby Marie in my arms, at the thin white scar across her tiny throat, and felt something harden inside me. These children deserved peace. They deserved rest. And if their own family had given up on finding it for them, then I would have to try. "What if we could find this thing?" I said slowly. "What if we could force it to break the bargain?" The children looked at each other, and in that silent communication, I saw hope flicker for the first time. "It's dangerous," Thomas warned. "Everyone who's tried to confront it has either died, gone mad, or both." "I'm not everyone," I said with more confidence than I felt. "I'm a doctor. I'm trained to face impossible situations and find solutions. And I can't just leave you like this." Celeste stepped forward and took my hand. Her small fingers were cold. "If you really want to help us, there's something you need to see. Something we've never shown an outsider before." They led me out of the house in the deepest part of the night, when even the stars seemed reluctant to shine on Bellefontaine. Philippe had locked himself in with Evangeline, and I could hear him murmuring to her through the door, trying to calm her madness. But I had a different task now. The 5 children and I crossed the overgrown grounds, moving past the slave quarters that stood empty and rotting. The Duponts had freed their slaves years ago, though whether from conscience or because they could no longer afford them, I didn't know. Now, those buildings stood as silent witnesses to other suffering, other cruelties that had soaked into this cursed land. At the edge of the property, where the manicured grounds gave way to wild bayou, Thomas stopped. "This is where it begins," he said. "There's a path, but it's old and overgrown. You have to know how to look for it." I watched as he moved with practiced ease through what looked like impassable undergrowth, and the other children followed. I had no choice but to trail behind, cradling baby Marie against my chest, trying to protect her from the branches that grabbed at us like skeletal fingers. The temperature dropped as we moved deeper into the swamp. The air grew thick with moisture and the smell of decay. But it was more than that. There was a wrongness here, a feeling that we were entering a place where natural laws didn't fully apply. The sounds of the normal world faded behind us until all I could hear was our breathing and the squelch of mud beneath our feet. We walked for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes. The children never faltered, moving through the darkness as if they could see perfectly. Finally, we emerged into a clearing, and what I saw there made my breath catch in my throat. In the center of the clearing stood something that might have once been an altar or might have always been what it was. A twisted arrangement of cypress roots grown into an almost throne-like shape. The roots were massive, black with age and glistening with moisture, formed into a seat that faced back toward where Bell Fountain must lie. But it was what surrounded the altar that truly disturbed me. Bones. Hundreds of them, arranged in careful patterns on the ground. Some so old they'd sunk into the earth, others more recent, still white and clean. Animal bones mostly, I hoped, though some of the skulls looked disturbingly human-sized. "This is where the first Philippe made his bargain," Thomas said quietly. "We remember it. We all remember it, passed down through our rebirths. He came here desperate, ready to promise anything. And something answered." "What was it?" I asked. "What kind of creature?" "We don't know exactly," Celeste said. "In our memories, it's always wrong, always changing. Sometimes it looks like a man dressed in clothes from another century. Sometimes it's just a voice in the darkness. Sometimes it's a presence that makes your mind want to shut down rather than process what you're seeing." Henri pointed to the bone patterns. "These are offerings. Every Dupont generation leaves them, hoping to appease it, hoping it will show mercy. It never does." I stepped closer to the throne of roots, and immediately wished I hadn't. The air directly around it was even colder, so cold my breath misted despite the Louisiana heat. And there was a smell, sweet and rotten at once, that made my stomach turn. "What are we doing here?" I asked. Thomas met my eyes. "We're summoning it. We're going to force it to appear, and then you, Doctor, are going to do what generations of Duponts have been too afraid to do. You're going to demand it free us." "I don't have any power over this thing," I protested. "If your own family couldn't break the bargain." "Our family is bound by the bargain," Celeste interrupted. "But you're not. You're outside it. Maybe that means you can negotiate where they couldn't. Maybe that means you can see something they couldn't see. Or maybe—" she paused. "Maybe you can kill it." "Kill it? You can't kill something like this." "You can kill anything that exists in this world," Thomas said with certainty. "And it does exist here. It lives in this bayou. It's tangible enough to make bargains, tangible enough to enforce them. Which means it's tangible enough to die." Young Josephine spoke up, her tiny voice barely audible. "It fed on our suffering for so long, fed on our deaths and rebirths, on our memories and pain. Maybe it's grown fat and slow. Maybe it doesn't expect anyone to fight back anymore." I looked at these impossible children, old souls in young bodies, and realized they'd been planning this. Perhaps for years, across multiple lifetimes, waiting for the right moment, the right person to help them. "How do we summon it?" I asked. Thomas smiled, but there was no joy in it. "Blood," he said simply. "The bargain was sealed in blood. It's awakened by blood." Before I could stop him, he pulled a small knife from his pocket and drew it across his palm. Dark blood welled up and dripped onto the bone patterns. Celeste did the same, then Henri, their young faces solemn and determined. Even Josephine held out her tiny hand for Thomas to make a small cut. "Your turn, Doctor," Thomas said, offering me the knife. I hesitated. This was madness. I was a physician, a rational woman, and I was standing in a Louisiana swamp about to perform some sort of blood ritual to summon an entity from a children's ghost story. Except it wasn't a story. Baby Marie in my arms had the scars to prove it. The ledgers in the house had documented it. Generations of suffering testified to its truth. I took the knife and cut my palm, gasping at the sharp pain. My blood joined theirs, dripping onto those ancient bones. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the temperature dropped even further, cold enough that I could see ice crystals forming on the nearby vegetation. The baby in my arms began to cry, a thin, terrified wail, and something stepped out of the shadows. I wish I could describe it clearly, but my mind slides away from the memory even now. It was tall, I think, or maybe it just gave the impression of height. It wore the shape of a man in old-fashioned clothes, but the proportions were wrong, the angles impossible. His face was in shadow, but I had the terrible impression that if I saw that face clearly, I would lose my mind. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in my bones. "Dupont blood," it said, "and a new supplicant. What do you seek?" The children had all shrunk back, even brave Thomas showing fear. But they'd brought me here for this purpose, and I couldn't let them down. "I seek to renegotiate the bargain made in 1782, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady. "The curse on these children must end." The thing that was not quite a man laughed, and the sound made the bones on the ground rattle. "The bargain is sealed. The price is paid in perpetuity. Dupont prosperity in exchange for Dupont children, bound to this land until the earth itself ends." "That's not a bargain, that's torture," I argued. "These are children. They've done nothing to deserve this suffering. They are the price, the cost of their ancestors' greed. He wanted everything. I gave him everything. Now he pays, through them, forever." "The first Philippe is long dead," I said. "He's not paying anything. These children are." "Yes," it agreed, and I could hear something like satisfaction in that terrible voice. "And they will continue to pay. Death after death, life after life, memory upon memory, suffering compounding suffering. It sustains me, feeds me, it amuses me." So Josephine had been right. This thing fed on their pain, drew power from the cycle of death and rebirth. Which meant, "If the children are free, you starve," I said slowly. The temperature dropped even further. "They will never be free." "Everyone can be free," I said, and pulled out the knife still slick with our blood. "Even you. Death is freedom from all bargains." It moved faster than I could see, suddenly right in front of me, and up close it was worse, so much worse than I'd thought. The face was a swirling void, and looking into it was like staring into every nightmare I'd ever had. "You cannot kill me, little physician. I am older than your civilization, older than your species. I have drunk the blood of 1,000 bargains, and I will outlast everything you love." But in its arrogance it had gotten too close. "And I am, if nothing else, a woman who acts when action is needed." I drove the knife into what I hoped was its chest, felt it sink into something cold and yielding, and twisted. The thing screamed, a sound that seemed to tear reality itself, and I felt its blood, if it was blood, pour over my hands, burning like ice. It stumbled backward, clutching at the wound, and for just a moment, I saw its true form. I can't describe it, won't describe it. Some things are better left unknown. But I understood in that instant that it was ancient, yes, but also vulnerable. Mortal. Killable. The children must have understood too, because suddenly they were there beside me, each one grabbing at the thing, pulling it down. It was still screaming, thrashing, but we had surprise on our side and perhaps the weight of its own complacency. Thomas pulled the knife from where I'd stabbed it and drove it in again. Then Celeste. Then Henri. Even little Josephine, her tiny hands barely able to grip the handle, added her own strike. And with each blow, the thing grew weaker, its form becoming less solid, less real. "You cannot. The bargain. The bargain dies with you," I said, and took the knife one last time. I drove it into the center of that swirling void where its face should have been, and pushed with all my strength. The thing that had tormented generations of Duponts let out one final, terrible cry, and then it was gone. Not fading, not dissolving, just suddenly absent, as if it had never existed. The knife fell to the ground, smoking and corroded. We stood in that clearing for a long time, none of us quite believing what had just happened. Baby Marie had stopped crying and was making small, curious sounds, as if she too sensed the change in the air. "Is it over?" Celeste whispered. "Is it really over?" Thomas knelt down and touched the bone patterns on the ground. They crumbled to dust at his touch, scattering in a wind that had suddenly picked up, as if the bayou itself was exhaling after holding its breath for nearly 80 years. "I think," he started, then stopped. His face contorted with sudden pain, and he grabbed his chest. "I think I can feel it. The memories, they're fading." Celeste gasped. "Mine too. The drowning, the wagon accident, I can still remember them, but they feel like stories now. Like things that happened to someone else." Henri was crying, but they were tears of relief. "I can't remember the stove. I can't remember burning. It's going away. It's really going away." We made our way back to the house as the first light of dawn was breaking through the trees. I'd never been so grateful to see the sun. The walk back seemed shorter, easier, as if the very land was breathing easier now that the curse was lifted. At Bellefontaine, Philippe met us at the door. He looked haggard, aged another 10 years in one night, but his eyes widened when he saw us all alive and whole. "What happened?" he demanded. "You took them into the bayou, in the middle of the night." "We ended it," Thomas said simply. "The curse, the bargain. It's over, Father. We killed the thing that bound us." Philippe stared at his son, then at me, then back at Thomas. That's impossible. My father tried. His father tried. Every generation was bound by the bargain," I explained. "But I wasn't. And with the children's help, we found it and we ended it. Your children are free now, Monsieur Dupont. Truly children, not trapped souls condemned to cycle forever." He collapsed against the doorframe, and I wasn't sure if he was laughing or sobbing. "Free," he whispered. "After all these years, all this suffering, free." Inside, Evangeline was awake, sitting by the window in her room. When we entered, she looked at us with eyes that, while still haunted, held a spark of something I hadn't seen before. Hope. I handed baby Marie to her, and she cradled the infant gently. "She feels different," Evangeline said softly. "Lighter somehow, as if a weight has been lifted." "Because it has," Celeste said, climbing onto the bed beside her mother. "We're free, Maman. All of us. We don't have to remember anymore. We don't have to carry the deaths." Evangeline touched Marie's throat, where the scar still showed white against her skin. "The scars remain? Physical marks don't vanish just because the curse is broken," I said. "But they're just scars now. Marks on skin, nothing more. They don't carry the weight of remembered trauma anymore. Your daughter is truly a newborn, Madame Dupont. She'll grow up as any child does, with no memory of lives lived before, no burden of deaths suffered." Over the following days, I stayed at Bellefontaine to monitor both Evangeline's recovery and the children's adjustment to their new freedom. It was remarkable to watch the change in them. Thomas began playing as a 10-year-old should, climbing trees and laughing with genuine joy. Celeste started speaking in the present tense instead of mixing past lives into her conversation. Henri and Josephine began exhibiting normal childhood behaviors, curiosity and wonder replacing their ancient exhaustion. The scars remained, of course. They always would. But as the days passed, even the family began to see them differently. Not as evidence of a curse, but as marks of survival. These children had been through something no human should endure, and they had come out the other side. On my last morning at Bellefontaine, I stood in that same bayou clearing with Thomas. In the daylight, with the curse broken, it looked like any other patch of swampland. The throne of roots was just roots. The bone patterns had completely disintegrated. There was no trace of the horror that had existed here. "Dr. Mercier," Thomas said, his voice carrying the lightness of actual childhood now. "I'm forgetting. Not everything, but the old lives are becoming like dreams. Distant and unreal. Is that normal? I think it's exactly what should happen," I told him. You were never meant to remember all of that. No one is. Your mind is healing, letting go of what it doesn't need to carry anymore. Will I forget all of it eventually? He asked, and there was something wistful in his voice. Even the bad parts were part of me, part of us. You'll remember what matters, I said. The rest will fade as it should. But Thomas, you and your siblings, you survived something impossible. You ended something that had tormented your family for generations. That strength, that courage, that will stay with you forever. He smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. Thank you, Doctor, for believing us, for helping us, for being brave enough to do what generations of Duponts couldn't. I left Bellefontaine that afternoon, looking back at the old house one last time. It looked different in the daylight, less like a monument to decay and more like a place that might, someday, be restored to beauty. The children stood in the front yard waving goodbye, and they looked like any other children in Louisiana, except for the scars. But as I'd told Evangeline, the scars were just scars now. Marks on skin, stories etched in flesh, but no longer gates to past traumas. The Dupont children had been born with old scars, yes, but they would live new lives. Real lives. Free lives. Sometimes, late at night, I think about what we did in that clearing. About the thing we killed and the curse we broke. I think about the nature of bargains and the price of prosperity, about what people will sacrifice for success and how those sacrifices echo through generations. The Dupont plantation still stands, though I hear the family left it years after that summer. Last I knew, Philippe and Evangeline had moved to Virginia with their 5 children, starting fresh in a place with no memories, no curse, no weight of the past. I never told anyone the full story of what happened at Bellefontaine. Who would believe it? A creature from the bayou that bound children in an eternal cycle of death and rebirth? It sounds like the ravings of someone who spent too long in the Louisiana heat. But I kept a small reminder. The knife we used to kill that thing, or what was left of it. The handle survived, though the blade had corroded away to nothing. I keep it in my desk drawer, and sometimes I take it out and hold it, reminding myself that impossible things exist in this world, and that impossible things can be ended. I still practice medicine in New Orleans. I still deliver babies throughout the parishes, and I always check them carefully for scars. Not birthmarks, not blemishes, but scars. Old scars that shouldn't exist on new skin. I've never found any. The curse was unique to the Duponts, it seems, and it died with the thing in the bayou. But I check anyway because I learned something important that summer in 1860. Some horrors are real. Some curses can be broken. And sometimes, the only thing standing between eternal suffering and freedom is someone brave enough or foolish enough to fight back. The Dupont children were born with old scars, bearing the weight of lives they should never have had to live. But they don't carry that weight anymore. They're free. And in a world full of darkness, that one small victory against the impossible still gives me hope. The scars remain, yes, but they're just scars now. Just scars. And sometimes that's enough.